Bach's cantatas, for instance. He wrote cantatas to be done every day in worship. And we're lucky if we can do one a year. And so Bach didn't get there, of course, overnight. He wasn't just a genius that condescended to the people of Leipzig in the 1700s. He was the beneficiary of thousands of years of Christianity and priorities and civilization being geared towards one common goal. So,
amen.
And we're here sort of at this part of it. So the good news is that even though we're here at the bottom, we're pointing that way. We're going up. And,
right.
One of the things that I say when I'm talking about church music philosophy is our late Bishop Royal Grote, the presiding bishop of the REC, he said, leave the church better than you found it. Pretty simple. And really, I don't think very difficult to do. It's simple to understand, and it's relatively simple to execute. But if we all leave the church, and the church music by extension, better than we found it, then we will eventually get back to where we might be able to do works to the caliber of Bach, and maybe even beyond that, if the culture doesn't decay with Enlightenment philosophies again.
Hello everyone, I'm here with Andrew Dittman, a good friend who I met when I was in Texas, studying at UNT, and my wife and I went to his church several times at the Chapel of the Cross, and that is where our daughter Annika was baptized, and he's a great musician. He just produced a curial, which, who knows what a curial is? I guess he'll have to tell us, and then composes and arranges a lot of stuff, a lot which I use, and is even involved in some hymnal projects. So, thank you for being here, Andrew.
I'm glad for you to have me.
Yes. Okay, so first, what is a curial?
That's a good question. So, a curial is a collection of musical mass settings. So, mass, of course, meaning the ordinary parts that would be sung in a service of Holy Communion. So we would have the Kyrie, the Lord have mercy upon us, the Sanctus, which is Holy, 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 the Creed, the I believe in one God, and then the Agnus Dei, O Lamb of God that takest away the sins of the world, and the Gloria in Excelsis, the glory to God in the highest, or glory be to God on high, depending on which prayer book you might use. So this right here is a curial, edited by Canon Charles Winfred Douglas, who also was the principal editor of the 1940 hymnal that's in use still among a lot of Anglican churches in America. And he was a priest and a composer and a musicologist who studied with the monks at Salem, who also did a lot of work in recovering old plain chant traditions and formatting them for what then is modern use, but of course still today could be modern use.
Charles Winfred Douglas?
Charles Winfred Douglas.
Okay.
And he was in near Nashotah in Wisconsin for a while. I believe he planted a church in Colorado as well, all over the place, but a pretty wide opus of work. And he,
Okay.
but anyway, so this right here the St. Dunstan's curial, which I love, this evergreen, and it's a good size. He has the different mass settings, and he did it in this 4-line old plain chant notation, which is fun to read from and not as convoluted to learn if you already know how to read modern notation. It's pretty fun to learn how to read this other notation. So I
Now he was Anglican.
He was an Anglican. Yes, that's right. Part of the Episcopal Church.
So
before the Episcopal Church,
this was
nuts.
Gregorian chant from the Catholic Church, but this was for the use in Anglican setting.
That is correct. So it has the normal parts. I mean, so in the English Reformation, Thomas Cranmer and then John Marbeck adapted the Latin liturgies into English. Now, I'm not much of a musicologist as far as that's concerned, so I don't know how much of it was the Sarum rite, meaning from the church at Salisbury, or from the Roman rite. But at any rate, they adapted existing Latin Mass settings, not just of the sung parts, but of the entire liturgy, spoken or otherwise, into English. So in a lot of ways, it was a very conservative revolution, because they went back to a lot of things that had been lost or had been sort of caked over with several layers of sediment that got in the way of things. I mean, that's typical Reformation apology. But at any rate, the musical settings are just of the old Latin and Greek in the case of the Kyrie, but they've been translated into English. And Latin is very different from English because Latin almost always has a syllable that trails away at the end. Altissimus, right, meaning the most high. But we would say the most high, and so high has the emphasis right at the last syllable of the phrase. And so to adapt Latin text with Latin music into English, you have to make some adjustments. And so Winfred Douglass did that, and he made several adjustments. Anyway, I came about this project. I didn't set out to create a new curial. That just sort of happened after a number of other dominoes fell. So my church, it's good to know a little bit about the background of my church. So the Chapel of the Cross in Uptown Dallas is a Reformed Episcopal church, and it was started back in the 80s when...
Brief pause. Remember where you're at. I'm pausing it.
So the Chapel of the Cross, Reformed Episcopal Church, the membership came from an Episcopal church, Church of the Incarnation, also in Dallas. And in the 1979 Book of Common Prayer came out, and there was a large contingent of people at Church of the Incarnation that were not interested in using the 79 prayer book. And also coupled with that, there was a mandate from the Bishop of Dallas that required the main service to be Holy Communion every Sunday. Now, Chapel of the Cross, Church of the Incarnation, was part of a much broader tradition, a low church tradition is what it's called, that, among other things, their usual pattern was they would have Holy Communion on first Sundays of the month, and then morning prayer all other Sundays of the month. And so that was done away with by a Bishop of Dallas, just with a big rubber stamp. And so they had two different services, two different factions of people at Incarnation, but eventually it became untenable to stay. And so they moved. They rented a building in SMU to use the 1928 Book of Common Prayer and to do the usual lineup of services. But then they bought their building, which was an old Church of Christ, just a god awful monstrosity of an architectural. It was just awful. But they did a really wonderful job of beautifying and Anglicanizing it, and
That's
they
where
got
you're
an
currently
organ.
at.
That's where I'm currently at. That's where I'm at
Like
actually
that's
right
the
now.
building of Chapel of the Cross.
This is the building of Chapel of the Cross, and
Oh, okay.
so. But at any rate, they continue to do morning prayer as the main service for most of the Sundays, except Holy Communion on first Sundays. But as newer people came, this was decades later, newer people started to come. Well, they started to expect Holy Communion to be every Sunday, which is, of course, a good thing to want.
Sure.
And so we and my rector, now Bishop John Bonesire, he decided that we will keep all of the morning prayer, we'll keep the regular rotation of services, but after the morning prayer services, we would have an abbreviated Holy Communion that doesn't do the things that already were done in morning prayer. So we had already said the Apostles' Creed in morning prayer, so we wouldn't say the Nicene Creed then in the Holy Communion service that follows. We already confessed our sin, so there wouldn't be a confession or absolution, and so on and so forth. Furthermore, on the first Sundays, when we normally would have Holy Communion, we also would do the first part of morning prayer. And so it was a real commitment to really using the prayer book fully as it was intended to be used.
Brief pause. I
yep.
gotta give the key away.
All right, we're back.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so so we decided to do that. We called it a supplemental communion at the time. We don't call it anymore, although there's not really a good name for it. So we went to having Holy Communion about 14 times on a Sunday or a feast day a year, and to having it done about 54 times. And as a musician, I didn't like the idea of we only knew two services, the Healy Willen Missa de Maria Magdalena,
Which is
as
great.
Which
it's
is
really
great.
good. No one has a problem with it. Yeah.
The issue is that I didn't want to get sick of it. And then also John
enough.
Marbeck's English plain song service that he did at the behest of Thomas Cranmer 1 year after the first 1549 Book of Common Prayer. The Book of Common Prayer noted. So we would do those two.
Which is also good. I don't do it here, so I don't know it as well as
it's
the
great.
Willen, but it's good.
There's nothing wrong with it. I do love both of those things. But this was just more is what we were after. And so I set out to harmonize. I mean, so I'm a composer, and I always have enjoyed choral singing, and I didn't, and the Willen, and first of all, the Willen doesn't work a cappella, because, and this service would be a cappella, in order to also to sort of separate it from the morning prayer, even though it was a continuation of the morning prayer, which was a pastoral decision, which communicated to the people who were really entrenched in the morning prayer as being the main service, that we really are not going to change this. This is not any rug ripped out from you. We're just adding another thing that's in some ways entirely separate, but of course it's connected. So pastoral decision. But there's another, the fourth communion service in the 1940 hymnal was my first attempt at this, and so I took the melodies, and the harmonies in the 1940 hymnal are not, they're for organ. They're not for choir, and it wouldn't really work very well for a choir to try and sing the organ harmony. I mean, it could be done, but it wouldn't be optimal. So I harmonized it for choral singing, which could work either a cappella. Obviously, it could work unison, because these are plain chant melodies. But it could work a cappella in harmony. It could work unison in a cappella. It could work with organ accompaniment unison. It could work with organ accompaniment and harmony. All these different permutations. I wanted it to be as usable as possible. So I did the first one, and so I just was using the 1940 hymnal. And then when I get to the Gloria, I notice that Winfred Douglas, on the word, we were talking about this earlier, on Art Most High in the Gloria of God the Father, the very end of the Gloria in Excelsis, it goes, Art Most High in the glory. And so the word high is on the lowest note in that phrase, which I thought was strange. It was not very good text painting. So I went from this to look at this, which is the Liber Usualis, and you can see how thick it is. It's got more pages than the Bible. This is pretty much an exhaustive Book of Common Prayer for the Roman Catholic Church that has propers for all of the saints' days, all the major saints' days, the minor saints' days, anything that you could ever want is as far as that liturgy is found there. So I looked at the Mass that he based it on, which was, in this case, the Alma Pater. Just the Gloria was from the Alma Pater. All the other ones were from another Mass called Cum Jubilo. But I noticed that the word Altissimus, which is Art Most High, was at the highest point. And so I said, all right, well, I'm not sure exactly what Winfred Douglas was thinking this time. So I decided to use this Liber Usualis as the primary source, and then his curial as the secondary source. And so so I changed that, and then so we had our first Holy Communion service that we could sing, and it worked well. People liked it. The melodies are lovely, of course, and they're timeless, and it worked to sing it congregationally in harmony. Furthermore, with some hymns, if we were to do them a cappella, if the men, the tenors and basses in the congregation who were uncomfortable singing the melody, if they were uncomfortable singing harmony, excuse me, if they sang the melody, a lot of times it messes up the voice leading because the melody goes below the bass part then. And so I wrote this in order that wouldn't happen. And so the bass part never drops below or never goes above the melody. So another way to make it as useful as possible. So anyway, I did that one. And
let me ask a question real quick.
Mm-hmm.
So in the 1940, is that one Mass that Winfred Douglas set? Or is it the compilation? I mean, or is there a whole bunch of them?
Yes. So that's a good question. So that's the one that is. There are a few others in the 1940 hymnal, but they're sort of piecemeal. Not all of them are there. There's a creed that's plain song. There's this other one that's plain song. And I found this out basically just by keeping on going down this rabbit hole. Yes, what we would call the fourth communion service is known by some Anglicans as the Missa Marialis. And this was a name that Winfred Douglas gave to it because it was the Mass appointed for Marian feast days, like the Annunciation or the Presentation of Christ in the Temple, also known as the Purification of the Blessed Virgin Mary. And so he took that from that, like I said earlier, he took the Kyrie and the Sanctus in Agnus Dei from Missa Cum Jubilo, and the Gloria from the Missa Alma Pater. And before I get too confusing, the reason these masses have these nicknames is because they're based on pre-existing plain chants, some of which we still have, and others that have been lost, that started with those words. So the Missa Cum Jubilo, I believe the Kyrie is based on a chant called Cum Jubilo, and I don't know anything really about that chant, but that's how these masses got their nickname. But both of those masses, the Cum Jubilo and Alma Pater, are appointed for Marian feast days, and so he picked from both of them which ones he thought were, I guess, the most workable, and called them Missa Marialis in order to correspond with that Marian feast day.
Are all of the harmonizations of Gregorian chant in the 1940 done by Winfred Douglass?
I believe so, though it's not. He was a pretty humble man, and so he didn't always put his name on things. But he was the principal editor. So I looked to see about the other mass settings, and like I was saying, both of these curials have the masses organized by. They're appointed for different feast days and seasons in the church year, and so. We weren't necessarily picky about which mass setting we would do when, but I figured this is a tradition that we inherited. There must be some wisdom there, and so I look at the Mass 11, which is called Orbis Factor, and that
Okay.
is the one that is appointed for the regular Sundays throughout the year, so where the altar would be green after Epiphany and after Trinity. And so, and I noticed that the melody was much more accessible than the Cum Jubilo, the Missa Marialis. And so I said, well, this is an obvious next one because this will be easily picked up. I mean, I think the Gloria only had a range of a sixth,
Okay.
and just all generally. Anyway, so I did that one, and uh, then and that worked well. Another thing that I found out is that these curials are organized where they have the Kyrie, the Sanctus, the Agnus Dei, and the Gloria as part of the Mass. But then the creeds are all separate. They're kind of over here. There's only, I believe, 6 plain song creeds. But then there's
Okay.
in this Liber Usualis, there's 6 plain song creeds, but there's 19 mass settings.
Interesting. And how'd you
So
pick the ones that you picked? I mean, some of it you just said was accessibility. Orbis factor rather was easier for people to sing and for a regular basis. And cum jubilo is kind of what you started with. But you
yes,
have what, 7 others that you've done?
11 total. So yeah, so after I did the normal Sundays throughout the year, the next one that I did was Mass 1, which is the one that is appointed for Eastertide. And then after that, I did the one that is appointed for Sundays in Advent and Lent. And that doesn't have a Gloria because you wouldn't do a Gloria in Advent and Lent. And so usually we would just do one of these other Mass settings, and we just wouldn't do the Gloria. But now these are these masses that are specific for these times, and they don't even have one. And so then one of my friends who used to be a priest here at the Chapel of the Cross, now he's planted a church in Atlanta, Marietta area. He was having he wanted to do a service for women, I guess for everybody, but mourning the loss of children in utero. So either due to miscarriage or abortion or whatever the case might have been. And so he wanted me to come out there and do music for this because there was still a church plant and they didn't really have their music program as solidified. And so I said, this is great. And there is a Mass for the departed in the Liber Usualis. And so then I did those pieces, the Kyrie, the Agnus Dei, and the Sanctus. And the Agnus Dei for the Mass for the departed, instead of saying, have mercy upon us and grant us thy peace, it says, grant them rest, and then grant them rest everlasting. Which is interesting because in the prayer book, it says, then shall be sung a proper hymn. And we usually use the Agnus Dei, but I'm wondering if the reason that it doesn't say specifically the Agnus Dei is because sometimes you could have this different one that has this alternate text. But anyway, so I did that one, and then after that I was saying, well, why stop now? And so all of these masses are each of the melodies are in different medieval modes. There are 8 medieval modes, and they're kind of grouped by 2. So modes 1 and 2 are Dorian and Hypodorian, and
Okay.
3 and 4 are Phrygian, Hypophrygian, and then 5 and 6 are Lydian and Hypolydian, and then 7 and 8 are Mixolydian and Hypomixolydian, which are Greek names. If you're
So where does Ionian and Aeolian and Locrian come in?
yeah, that's a good question. So these modes are not the same as the modern modes. Modern modes basically just say, all right, we're going to play all white notes on the keyboard, and we're just going to start at this note and go up. The medieval modes, they had to do with the range of the melody. And then also there were other anomalies that wouldn't really work in the what we would consider the modern modes. For instance, in Dorian, da 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 da, and it has that raised sixth that's different than what we would normally hear in minor. Well, in this medieval plain chants, if you would only go up to that sixth, it would be flatted. Da 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 da. If you go just that and then down, it would be flatted. It would be that lowered, that half step. But if you went up, it would be the raised. Da 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 da, dee 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 dee, or something like that. And so it would depend on the context for what the notes were. But so there's Dorian here, and then Hypodorian, hypo meaning below, which is basically...
And that's a fourth below, right?
Yeah, generally about a fourth below, but these modes
So then
sort of behave differently.
Hypodorian basically is Aeolian, right?
Not
Except the
not
Aeolian,
exactly.
I guess you could say, is centered around A.
Yeah,
If-
I mean,
whereas Hypodorian is still centered around D.
this is like, when
Right?
we go back in time and talk about, was Abraham Lincoln gay? It's like, gay didn't exist at that point.
Well,
It's just like, who knows? It's a modern thing. So you can edit this out. But it's just a weird anachronistic viewing, trying to get these ancient things to fit in the modern terminology. But at any rate, there's 8 medieval modes, and so I wanted to make sure, and there's 4 main groups, and so I wanted to make sure that in this curial, now at this point it's becoming a curial, and so I wanted to make sure that the melodies the different modes were represented, and other than that, it was just the ones that I thought would work well adapted into English, because that was always a challenge, and then also. Just the melodies that I thought were the strongest, and it's very subjective. But at any rate, I ended up with 11. So there's Mass 1, which is for Easter, and then there's Mass 2, which is for high feast days, and then the next one that I did was Mass 6. These were not in the order that I did them, but the order as they appear in the curial. Mass 6, which is for feast days, Mass 8, which is for feast days. That one is probably going to be one of the most popular, if any of this becomes popular at all, because that mode is Lydian or Hypolydian, but because of those weird things, it really works out to be major. Lydian has the da 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 dum, but da 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 da. If it goes, they don't want to outline that tritone, so it just goes up and then it will go back down. It has to do with the way the melody flows. Anyway, but it works out to be basically just major. So I think that will be the most accessible for those modern ears. And then there's
sure.
Mass
And how many
9.
of these does your church know?
They know 5 of them, and I hope to expand that soon. But yeah, they know the first ones that I did.
And they could sing them without organ, a cappella, for the service.
They do sing them without organ, a cappella. Now the choir sits together and we try and help everybody else along, and it's not been, immediately successful, but we've done a good job of saying, this is a thing that we're trying. Just sit back for the first few times, and then once you feel like joining in, please do. But But yeah, we've had to be pastoral about it, about how we've approached it in order for it to be workable. So that's a pretty common thing.
And the Lord's Prayer that you do, so that's not
Yeah.
in the Mass settings. That's its own thing, right? Or
Well, yes, that is correct. Yeah, the Lord's Prayer is not included, and it's actually, as far as I can tell, it's not in any of the 2,400 pages in this. But Winfred Douglass does have one in his. In fact, he has two. So yes, but they would be their own section, as well as the different responses to the Mass, like the Lord be with you, or the Glory be to thee, O Christ, Glory be to thee, O
Right.
Lord, at the Gospel, and the Sursum Corda, and things like that.
I must say, I visited the Eastern Orthodox Church a lot, and one of the generally most beautiful things is just listening to the Kedrov Lord's Prayer.
Mm-hmm.
It's on a cappella, and everyone there knows it, so everyone's singing it.
Yeah.
And I kept thinking, man, it would be awesome to sing the Lord's Prayer and this sort of a cappella fashion, and it's so meaningful rather than some cheesy, organ rendition that's
Sure.
been done, or the melot, which is fine for what it is, but not.
Yeah.
It's
By the way,
not
have
the
you
same
heard
ethos.
have you heard Elvis's recording of the Malott Lord's Prayer?
I have. It's
It
great.
is. It is sacrilegious, and it's also wonderful at the same time.
Yes.
But
He's like, you didn't think I could get there, did you?
Yeah, yeah. He sings it in an E flat, which means the high note of B flat, and he's just screaming. It's, to be fair, it's not a serious recording. They were just in a studio jamming. But yeah. Forever. Didn't think I could do it, did you? Yeah, it's
Pretty
funny.
great.
Back on
But
the
yeah,
Orthodox,
the first,
though.
but yeah, like I was just gonna say, the first time I felt that sort of ethos of singing the Lord's Prayer was the same sort of effect. Was hearing your harmonized Lord's Prayer at Chapel of the Cross with the whole congregation singing it a cappella. It straight brought me to tears. It was gorgeous.
Well,
And I tried to teach it here at the church that I'm at, St. Michael's. I don't know how well it caught on, but it's it's a little bit different of an aesthetic than Chapel
Well,
of the
sure,
Cross.
but and these things take time. They take time and exposure. If we're only trying to consume music that is easy to consume, then we're just only going to be doing pop music. Just like food. If it takes dedication to like Brussels sprouts for a lot of people, but once they do like it, they never stop liking it. But you were saying about the Orthodox, and I know that there are Orthodox churches that actually use the Book of Common Prayer, the Anglican Book of Common Prayer, and so I am curious to learn at some point if these settings would be workable in that environment. But
it's interesting because there is a Western rite. So there is a Western Rite Orthodox in the United States.
Right.
It is
The
very
Antiochian,
small.
I think.
Well, the Antiochians have one, and then believe it or not, ROCOR has one. Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia.
Sure.
But the one that everyone seems to be converting to, the most popular Orthodox in America, is the OCA, the Orthodox
Right.
Church of America, and they do not have a Western Rite. And I don't know, most of the priests I've met sort of hate the Western Rite. They're like, you should just do the Byzantine Rite and blah 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 for whatever reason. But there's arguments on both sides.
Sure.
I have never been to a Western Rite. I've seen some videos online from St. Peter's, which is actually in Fort Worth, I believe.
The only Orthodox services that I've been to have been weddings, and that's not a normal thing. So I don't really have much of a sample size to go on.
But I would think, I really do think that if you wanted a mostly a cappella, that aesthetic, that ethos of music, that these settings that you've done would be perfect. Now, granted, they would have an issue with some of the language in a few places. Like, it would have to be, they dropped the filioque.
Who proceedeth from the Father, who with the Father, and they'd have to mute. They'd have to add the mute for that one.
Or if all the Western Rite churches did it, maybe you could do a Orthodox version.
Yeah, or who knows? Maybe this is going to be the thing that brings the one
The filioque
holy
back to
Catholic
Orthodox
and Apostolic Church all back together. Weirder things have happened,
Yes.
right?
Yes. I think the filioque is one of those that. It was nice that the ACNA put it in brackets, but let's be honest, they just got to drop it. It's like, if there's ever going to be a rapprochement between East and West, the West is not going to hold on to the filioque. And honestly, I don't care, because it wasn't in the original.
Expertise here, but
yeah.
My understanding is the way that the West interprets it is really through the Son, who proceeded from the Father through the Son, which I don't believe the East would take any issue with.
They don't take issue, but they would still say, yeah, that's nice, and you could believe that, but you still didn't have the
it still went against
authority
the councils.
to change to change the creed. So, I don't care. I omit that part when we're saying the creed. I just say proceeds from the Father.
Yeah,
and then keep going. But
yeah, I don't know. Bach's B minor Mass wouldn't sound as good if you just chop those words off. So
yeah, but it's not. But you're not going to do the B minor Mass for service. I guess you could.
That's
be a long service.
Yeah, you got to have aspirations. But anyway,
yeah, I think it would be awesome. I would love to. Just so you know, I've shared a lot of your curial stuff with Orthodox music directors, saying, "Hey, you should see if you could use some of this at some point in the service." And so,
well, yeah, like I said, I if it gets used, that'd be great. Well, we were talking about the different Mass settings. So Mass 8, the Angelis, that's for feast days, and then Mass 9 and 10, those are for Marian feast days. Mass 11 for regular Sundays throughout the year. Mass 13 also for feast days, and then Mass 17, which is for Sundays in Advent and Lent. And then a Mass for the departed. And then I also did the John Marbeck's Mass, which is from the 1549 prayer book, or 1550 prayer book noted. So I harmonized that for choir singing. We have the organ harmonization from the hymnal that is perfectly fine, but it doesn't work just to make an arrangement of that for choir singing. So the Marbeck is the 11th, and that includes its own creed and its own Lord's Prayer, and so that's at the very end of the curial, because otherwise the other creeds and the other Lord's Prayer go with all of the preceding masses. So
yeah. Well, no, I dig it. I think the curial is great, and a lot of the settings that you have, I can see it's really traditional harmony. You said Winford Douglass did harmony, but it was more organ harmony, instrumental, less vocal. Was that right?
Yeah. He did hymns. It's not like that he only wrote for organs, but for these Mass settings, yes, his harmonization is I bet that Winfred Douglass might take exception to the fact that I'm trying to harmonize these. Might argue that they really are designed to be sung in unison, and that's how they're best performed, which is probably fair. But I just like harmony so much that I just had to do it.
Well, in the 1890s, there was this whole method. I think it was by Lemons, Lemmens, however you say that in French. I have horrible French pronunciation. Who created his own method of harmonizing Gregorian chant, but it's almost kind of modern. And then it's cool. I like the effect. I mean, you can see how even Messiaen sort of starts to come out of this tradition of harmonizing Gregorian chant, but through Le Mans and then his compositional methods, then you get Vidor, Vierne, they all start incorporating Gregorian chant into their music, which they really didn't do before the 1890s. It really wasn't a thing.
Yeah, well, that's one of the
things. But their
things.
method that they still use in church is really modal the way that they harmonize everything. Whereas the way that you've harmonized everything is much more of a traditional, almost hymn-like, but very beautiful and method.
Right.
But it doesn't have that modern modal feeling the way that perhaps a French organist might spontaneously improvise on or harmonize rather Gregorian chant singing.
Sure. Well, that was intentional. I mean, I could have gone off the deep end a little bit, but my goal was for these actually to be really usable congregationally, and so yeah, there's relatively few accidentals in the piece. It stays where it needs to stay. The only accidentals, I mean, there are some, but because if you try too hard just to stick to something occasionally, it'll suffer. So. I did it sparingly, at any rate. But going back on what you were talking about, these other things. I mean, these one of my main goals, besides to make it accessible, is also just to have another opportunity to recover these great melodies that have obviously withstood the test of time for a reason. I mean, 1,000-year-old melodies, and these things that they do stand the test of time in several different ways. I mean, you have these very modern treatments, like what you're talking about with these French composers, French Romantic and modern composers, and they really serve as a wonderful foundation for creativity, which is, I mean, creativity produces creativity, and this is sort of what we see, but also, we're living in a time where we are trying to recover these ancient traditions, these ancient rituals, and learn from the wisdom of the ages in a way that I mean, I'm not saying that previous generations haven't tried to do this, but they were, but it's becoming more, at least it's becoming more a fad, and so to anchor yourselves to these traditions, these sources of authority, rather than saying, I just like this thing, so I want my music to be this way. There's a lot of good faith byproducts that come from this. Saying that this is the tradition that I've received. How can I best live in it? How can I use these as the guideposts for cultivating virtue, for teaching my children in order that the third and fourth generation will still maintain these values and these traditions, and so that's sort of the over. If we really zoom out on Google Earth, that's the main goal. That's the main impetus for this project, is to have that is to a return to the tradition, and to have. And also to be able to sing that tradition anew. We're supposed to sing to the Lord a new song, but He also gives us the songs to sing in the Psalms. So it's not.
Well, it does seem to me that this is like your whole compositional style. Like Jonathan Pageau. His big thing before he became this famous YouTube guy was icon carving.
Right.
And he wrote for the Orthodox Arts Journal, and
he did the cover of your CD, which your listeners should buy if they haven't already.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Well, it was an independent thing, and then I asked him if I could use it as the cover of my CD. So, but I think using it as the cover did sort of give him the impetus to put it in color, because it wasn't in color before. And he's like, I needed a good excuse to put it in color.
It looks great.
Yeah, thank you. He was an artist before he sort of became this big YouTube guy, and he sort of talks about how when he was in art school, everything was about innovation, that which is new, finding your own style, hyper-individualism, and it just kind of ran dry spiritually, and he didn't really know how to incorporate art into his faith at the time. And then eventually, when he came back around to it, then he rediscovered this whole tradition of iconography. And then he, through learning in Africa, this particular style of carving rock, this particular type of stone, then he was able to sort of translate that into carving icons, and which sort of fits into this super niche, like ancient art of icon carving, which is they're all reliefs. So then it's not statuary, but it is reliefs, and he really has innovated in the style. So there's some famous iconography that he's done where, for example, one I think he did for Jordan Peterson, where it's a Saint Michael the Archangel, and there's embedded stones in it.
Yeah.
And there is plenty of, to my knowledge, plenty of Byzantine stonework and embedded jewelry within different things, like crowns and things like that. And the image of Saint Michael is a very traditional image, but it's still innovative in the sense of that was never paired together. There was never carved iconography with embedded stones in it. So that in and of itself is an innovation, but it's an innovation with pure deference to the tradition that has come before. So he's not innovating for the sake of innovation. And so this type of thing, and really the way that you compose anthems as well, like some of your anthems are great, like the mud anthem. I love the mud anthem. What's the real name? I keep calling it the mud anthem.
Well, yeah, it's Lord who hast formed me out of mud, which the text is from a poem by George Herbert called Trinity Sunday. But you can call it the mud anthem. I won't be offended.
Yeah, the mud. It's great, even though you think I play it too slow or too fast or whatever. I don't know, but but anyway, the style of composition and the style of this curial is very much that. It's a deference to tradition, while it is something entirely new. So maybe you could speak a little bit to that, where, did you take composition lessons in university, and is your style of composition a completely antagonistic towards that which they teach? Because I find that, I've taken a fair number of composition lessons where I specifically wanted to work on modal counterpoint and learning how to write in, species counterpoint, and that was super helpful. But I could still tell that they kind of thought, this is useful for understanding a few concepts, but in reality, this is just to understand the concepts. You shouldn't write in any of these styles, because you should find your own voice and do something entirely new. And the central focus was hyper-individualism.
Yeah, so I started out as a composition major. That was my first year at the University of North Texas, and I was majoring in composition. But what they really don't tell you is that you're really majoring in postmodern composition. It's composition with an asterisk next to it. But and so these projects were you had to use these techniques, which by definition would make things that don't sound good. Like, let's use the instrument in a way that it wasn't intended to be used, or let's forget all of the hierarchy of pitches that exists in nature. Let's go against that nature and work against that for these 12 tone rows, or the set theory, or different things like that, or aleatoric music. One of my composition projects that I had to do was I just dumped a box of Cheerios onto staff paper, and then I took a Sharpie and just poked through these holes, and then and I wasn't really graded on the music, which of course would have been ridiculous. I was graded on my essay that had to talk about the I don't know, whatever philosophy was behind me dumping this bowl of Cheerios on staff paper. So it was interesting to me that this postmodern thought is really stifling to creativity, because it doesn't really give you any guidance. In art doesn't exist without boundaries, and honestly, the only boundaries that they actually had, which I guess because they couldn't be really truly postmodern, because to be truly postmodern is to be no longer existent, I would say. But the only boundary that I had was a due date, right? And so anything that was actually worth anything that I produced in this class was only due to the fact that there was some constraint. And almost all of these, every single one of these projects that I did was making fun of these projects, which of course in postmodernism is perfectly fine. Cynicism is perfectly fine in postmodernism.
Everything is irony and sarcasm.
There is nothing really that's really true. So if you can have a laugh, then that's great. And so after, I didn't really understand this on an intellectual level as an 18, 19-year-old, but I, at the very least, couldn't justify to myself continuing a 4-year degree with which my parents were benevolent enough to pay for, getting a degree that I was making fun of getting. That just didn't seem to me to be a good use of time and resources. So I dropped the composition degree, and then I just switched to a Bachelor of Arts in Music, which was great because I could take really whatever class I wanted. And I was able to take other things that were actually useful, like these counterpoint. I took a doctoral level counterpoint class, and I took jazz arranging. I took all sorts of different things that I wouldn't have been able to take under the other degree program. But I was basically self-taught.
And that probably taught you how to compose, right? I imagine taking high-level counterpoint and high-level jazz arranging. For the type of stuff you do, what else could you ask for?
It definitely helped. I would say the way that I learned to compose, again, mostly self-taught, and I don't mean to say that as a source of pride, because I would have much preferred to have been taught well by a master. But what I would do was, so growing up, I would listen to barbershop quartets a lot, and a lot of other just a cappella, usually male a cappella groups like Chanticleer, the King Singers, and I would listen to these recordings, and I would say, that's really neat, except I would do it slightly differently. And so then what I would do is I would transcribe these, which is a great exercise and
it's probably why your ear is so good, because your tuning is great, and so
my ears are good because I use them, and I never stop using them, which is great, unless you're in a restaurant.
That's an important thing.
Unless you're in a restaurant and there's quote unquote background music, which I don't think background music actually is a thing, because it very quickly becomes foreground music to me. But at any rate, I would listen, and I would transcribe, and I would modify. And I didn't know this, but this is what a lot of composers, this is what Bach did. He copied other people's works, and he learned from it that way. And so then, as I sort of got and then when I took music theory, this was a great way to take music theory, because what I ended up doing was, instead of saying, oh, this is what this is, from the ground up, it was more, this is what this is called. You're already doing it, but this is what it's called. This is why what you're doing worked, or this is, in some cases, this is why what you're doing didn't work.
Or a better way of doing something.
Or a different way of doing something.
That's a gripe I have with theory. It's like theory for theory's sake is so stupid. Theory is there for two reasons.
With the music theory majors.
To learn to compose, or it's to learn how to interpret. That's the only two.
Yeah, it has to be connected with music. There's too many music theory and musicology majors who think that music should be seen and not heard, and it sort of boggles the mind. So I basically, and I took a semester of private composition lessons, which were, again, the only thing that they really did. I didn't really learn anything from my teacher, but just the fact that I sat down in order to expect to learn something. Of course, I ended up learning something. But it wasn't until probably about 3 or 4 years ago that I actually started studying with a composition teacher, Philip Lawson, who was a baritone of the King Singers back in the day, who's I gravitated to his music because he, like me, does all sorts of different styles. You know, he can write in sort of a Renaissance thing. But he does a lot of vocal jazz or pop arrangements, and I do similar things. You know, I don't really necessarily have a voice. I have several voices that sometimes work well together. Other times they're just sort of separate, and one piece will sound like this, and other people sound like this. And you know, the criticism you might hear is that, like, well, then you just don't have a voice. But I would say, you know, this is what I do. This is who I am. And each of these things are good, it doesn't really bother me that they're not terrifically original, because I'm mostly writing music. My litmus test for the music is, do I like it? Do I want to hear it? I remember a lot of my composition major friends saying, "Man, I can't stand listening to my own music." It's like, well, why would you force it on us? You know, so if I don't like to listen to my music, then what's the point? So, and hopefully other people will also like to listen to my music, and I can be able to share it with them, and continue to do that.
And what's the point of like writing some aleatoric postmodern nonsense that gets you awards, and even if you got a Grammy for it, I mean, there is no comparison to that. And then writing a mass setting or an anthem that's done in service to the glory of God, that then moves people's hearts and stirs up within them like a desire for repentance.
Yeah.
And I mean, there's no comparison between the two.
Well, that's another thing. You know, I was talking about reclaiming these traditions. You know, a lot of these masses are liturgical pieces that, if they're done at all, they're done in the concert hall, and that there are reasons for that, because the culture that produced these things, they kept on becoming more and more complex and involved, because they were built on these pre-existing traditions, and the cultures were built to sustain this sort of the sort of financial expenses that you would incur by doing these large scale works, and they were very much part. But now we don't have those institutions that are developed, and so one of the reasons that I think that these simple settings of the Mass will be good is because they will actually be doable in the liturgy without breaking the budget, and maybe at some point they will be a stepping stone to have something that is much more involved. I don't want to say necessarily better, but more, have more instrumental. You know, Bach's cantatas, for instance. He wrote cantatas to be done every day in worship, and we're lucky if we can do one a year. And so Bach didn't get there, of course, overnight. He wasn't just a genius that condescended to the people of Leipzig in the 1700s. He was the beneficiary of thousands of years of Christianity and priorities and civilization being geared towards one common goal. So,
Amen.
And amen. And we're here sort of at this part of it. So the good news is that even though we're here at the bottom, we're pointing that way. We're going up. And
Right.
one of the things that I say for other people when I'm talking about church music philosophy is our late Bishop Grote, Bishop Royal Grote, the presiding bishop of the REC, he said, "Leave the church better than you found it." Pretty simple, and really, I don't think very difficult to do. It's simple to understand, and it's relatively simple to execute. But if we all leave the church, and the church music by extension, better than we found it, then we will eventually get back to where we might be able to do works to the caliber of Bach, and maybe even beyond that, if the culture doesn't decay with Enlightenment philosophies again.
It's like some of that music. I love Lottie and Gesualdo and Victoria and Tallis. All that stuff is great, and it's fine hearing it in a concert hall. But so much of this stuff that was written specifically for like the Tenebrae services, or for a mass. It just feels out of place, even when it's done immaculately well by a professional choir. It's like, I want to do this in church. I want this to be the worship in church. Because it doesn't, sometimes, honestly, even some of the stuff is kind of boring to listen to. Like, after 30 minutes of, harmonized chant, you're like, okay, well, I can go to the next thing now. But if I was in service, and this was all contemplating God, then it's in its place where the telos is manifest.
And particularly if you already have a relationship with the words that are being said, because you say them potentially daily or weekly or at least yearly, and then you have the chance to have a composer be able to draw out a specific component of that text in the way that he sets the music, and then you can be the beneficiary of that liturgical experience because you've learned all these. I mean, if the only time you hear a mass is when it's done at a concert, it's not going to have the same kind of effect. And then also there are masses that are written for the concert hall and instead of the worship service. That's sort of when masses are only done in concert and only done in concerts, then then the kinds of masses that would be written were for that, and then they're not really set up to have that same kind of liturgical impact per se.
Right. When I was in Germany, occasionally we would make a little visit to the Anglican Church in Basel, but it was like an hour away, and it was like a Sunday evening service, and it was great when we could go. But typically on a Sunday morning, we're like, well, we're in Freiburg, let's just go to the Catholic cathedral. So we would go to the Freiburger Münster, and we would sing originally we sang in the choir before COVID happened while we were over there, which was a disaster. But before all of that, it was really striking to sing a full Rheinberger Mass with orchestra, humongous choir, as part of the Mass.
Mm-hmm.
It was like, oh, this makes sense. Like, this is exactly what this music was meant for. It would have been fine as a concert, but full orchestra and choir as part of the Mass, it just had its own feel to it. I'm like, man, we are really just shortchanging people on liturgical music. We could do so much more.
Yeah, well, it's one of the so I'm a lay reader at the church here, and when we have these sort of we meet 4 times a year to just sort of make sure that we know what we need to work on, what we need to improve upon. And one of the things that we hear a lot is this is not a drama, but it's certainly not less than drama. And I think that the idea of a drama is that it's ultimately look at me. And so just the focusing of the mind and the heart and the eyes forward, in our choir we have a choir, meaning the place where the choir sings, and the choir sings toward each other, right? It doesn't turn and perform to the people in the nave. That says something. But when you see Bach's St. Matthew Passion done in a concert, it's very much. I mean, it's lovely, of course, and I'll buy a ticket each time I can, but it's I imagine very different than being able to experience that where there is a high altar and there's a cross on the altar and you're reminded different additional layers of the real sacrifice of the risen Lord. And so the curial is just a feeble small attempt to try and go towards that direction.
Sure. One thing I wanted to go back to, you were talking about how even if the curial just brings about a new awareness of these Gregorian chants, that's great, because the Gregorian chants are great melodies, and people should know them. Now, this is a compositional thing that I've tried to wrestle with a little bit myself that I would love to kind of pick your brain about. So, for example, I understand species counterpoint relatively well, at least all the rules, the general rules of voice leading, and I do a fair bit of reharmonizing hymns. But one thing that I haven't done a ton of is just inventing my own melodies. And then if I look into the Anglican music, especially of Howells and Stainer and Perry and the great Anglican choral tradition, sometimes I think maybe it's just because they set specific texts, those texts needed to have slightly meandering melodies. But
Yeah.
I'm not entirely sure, and I do know that these Gregorian chants are great melodies. For sure, they're great melodies. But it just begs the question, what is maybe a few tips or hints that you would have specifically to writing melodies themselves? Not harmonizing them, and do you start with harmony and then move melody? I assume it's the opposite. You'd start melody and then go harmony.
It's generally opposite for me. Yeah, I have to have some sort of melody going on. Now, I would say that I'm not. I also would not consider myself to be a real natural or incredibly gifted melodist. But there are melodies that I've written that I like, of course. Otherwise, I wouldn't keep writing them. But no. So what I was saying, when I started out, I would do a lot of transcribing, and my arranging would be just ever so slight tweaks. And so then I would arrange other stuff, and so I was mostly an arranger, because you don't have to imagine the form of the piece, and you have a pre-existing form, and you have this, and you just have an idea that you can make, and so you don't have to do nearly as much work. Composing, I think, is just a lot more work, at least for me. I mean, it's I think different for different people, but one thing that I wouldn't say that I can't do it, but I definitely don't do it. I don't write instrumental music that just is that is original compositions. I only work from pre-existing melodies, and usually sung melodies with words. I have to.
But some of your anthems are original, like the Mud anthem. You created that melody,
right? But that was, that's Lord who has formed me out of mud. So obviously, I needed to start low, which I started with the basses, but the melody would also need to start out low. And move up, because you're being formed out of mud. There has to be some sort of ascendant quality. And so I think that again, the idea of boundaries and parameters really resulting in creativity. In order to have a melody that works, it has to serve the text. And so, the text is really the only muse that I have as far as writing any sort of good melody. And so, but with this Gregorian chant, the melodies were obviously already there, and all I had to do was just make sure they worked in English. But when I do melodies, my original melodies, and also there's there's the possibility that I'm just writing something that's in my head, that's only in my head because somebody else did it there. I wrote in my St. Timothy service, which is the morning and evening canticles for the daily office, as well as the responses. I based it off of Orlando Gibbon's short service, and I had sung his Venite and his Te Deum and his Benedictus, the morning canticles. I hadn't sung the Magnificat and the Nunc Dimittis, but I ended up, entirely inadvertently, the very first part of the Magnificat was verbatim, at least in the soprano part, not the rest of it, was exactly his melody. Now, to be fair, it's not a complicated melody. My soul doth magnify the Lord, right? 1, 2, 3, do, re, mi, melody. Blind mice 3. But it's at any rate. So there's not really truly original ideas, and so you don't have to. In this day and age, we're trying to squeeze copyrights and draw clear boundaries. So this is my thing that I did with absolutely nobody else's help. Which of course is not really the case, and I'm not a lawyer.
It's so silly.
But
it's like when people say, like, "Well, that wasn't really Bach; that was somebody else," and I'm like, "Dude, it was." If it could be attributed to Bach, I'm sure whoever wrote it pretty proud of what
Yeah.
they wrote.
Well,
Just attribute it to Bach.
but yeah, I mean, but Bach.
It's like pseudepigrapha. It's like, okay, yes, it wasn't Dionysius, but it's so silly to call it pseudo Dionysius.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's like,
But at any rate, it's all
Give
these
'em the win.
melodies. There are there's infinite permutations, but that doesn't mean that your creation is just thoroughly original because you didn't create.
But
the
like
voice,
Stanford and
for instance.
right, but like Stanford and Stainer, is there any particular things that you might notice about their melody writing that maybe I haven't noticed? And if not, that's fine. I just
As far as like how to do it, how to sort of replicate that process to write a melody.
maybe or things you notice they do, or maybe things they do with melodies that you think, oh, I'd love to be able to do that. Like you hear something great by Bairstow, and you're like, God, how did he come up with that? Like what's the Paragons?
Yeah, I mean, my guess is it's for those composers. I think it's the text. They get a and another thing that I say is in composing, it's better to be lucky than good. Some of my best work, I could look back on it and saying, I have no idea how I produced this. I don't think that I could replicate this. And
This is the muse.
sure. I mean, what I don't care how this lost. That's another thing. There's a lot of mythos about how to compose. This idea that you should just have it all in your head and then it should just come flowing out of the pen, or you don't need to be. If you're having to plunk it out on the piano to figure it out, just give up already. No, just do whatever you need to do to make whatever it is sound the best it can. And so for me, I use music notation software. I use Finale, and Lord willing, for as long as
Memory
it lasts.
Eternal.
I don't know how, because it's now deprecated software. But at any rate,
You're gonna go to Dorica?
I don't know. But at any rate, I click it in, and then I listen to it, and if I like it, then I keep it, and if I don't, then I change it. But it's not. The process is not as important as the result. Now, on the other hand, if you've streamlined the process, perhaps you can get through writing more things. So that may be, and that's obviously what Bach did. Bach, I mean, he started out writing at the keyboard, and eventually he could just write from his own memory. Though I guess he probably occasionally, like when he was writing that 6-voice fugue for the musical offering, he probably had to plunk a few things out. I don't know.
You think?
I don't know. I'm looking forward to asking him though. So I'm working on a recording project for this curial, and I'm working on getting it published, and hopefully Anglican churches that any church that speaks English will be able to use it. So.
Okay, so now I will not edit this next part. Okay.
Yep.
So speaking of none of that, there is another thing that I know that you were involved in, and that is what is currently probably my favorite hymnal that is out today, which is the 2017 Book of Common Praise.
Represent. Yep.
Yes, well, which is, I mean, it's the REC hymnal, right?
Yes.
And what Chris Hoyt, mutual friend, was the main editor.
That's correct.
But you did quite a bit of the harmonization in it. How much of it is your contribution, and what was that process like?
Well, I'm afraid to say that I have more hymn numbers in there than either Bach or Ray Vaughan Williams, but I don't know that should be shined too negatively upon me. But I think also some of those are duplicate texts, like one text to the same tune. But well, the main impetus behind that was they wanted every hymn in there to be able to be done in harmony, and some of the hymns previously were just melody and organ, and So I just harmonized a lot of those hymns that were that didn't have. There are some other ones that I that the selection committee chose that were like God in Mortal Flesh Revealed, or I have an original hymn in there as well.
Which is your original in there?
It's to the tune of Carrollton. I honestly don't remember the what text.
Oh, you did the text?
No, the tune.
You did the tune.
I don't remember the text. Which text is associated with it? But at any rate, yeah, it's. I'm overall pleased with it. However, our church doesn't use this hymnal. We use the 1940 hymnal, which is residual from. It's part of the church's core principles. Is to use the 1928 Book of Common Prayer and the 1940 hymnal, and those almighty bylaws. They would have to have a 80% majority 3 years in a row in order to change. And I don't believe that there's any interest in changing. And honestly, I mean, as much as I like the new hymnal, I have worked with the 40 hymnal, and so it would be inconvenient for me to actually change it, even though I worked on stuff. So I'm not pushing either way.
Interesting. Okay, so most of what you did was harmonized, but you do have some.
Yeah, I think I have.
You do have
just
some
one.
originals in there.
I don't know how many are in there again because I don't use it very much. At least not as a hymnal. I use the liturgical index in the back very frequently, which is great. But
oh yeah, it's a great liturgical index. Yeah. Although I'm pretty sure that y'all's lectionaries now nothing like our lectionary.
It is
in
not
the ACNA.
No, because we have a 1-year lectionary, the way the Lord intended. So,
is that the way the Lord intended?
I think so.
I am curious to know, and maybe you know, maybe you don't know. As far as the other churches are concerned, I mean, I know the Revised Common Lectionary and the Common Lectionary as well is all 3-year.
Yep.
But is the Orthodox Lectionary or the before the Common Lectionary what the Catholics used or what the Anglicans used was? I mean,
1 year.
What do other churches? Everybody's on 1 year
lectionary. Yeah. This is a 1-year lectionary, even though this was published in 1961, which is after the Second Vatican Council, I believe. It was 1 year lectionary, and the 1662 Book of Common Prayer also 1 year. Not that the Church of England uses the 1662, but they ought to, of course. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, the idea of the liturgical reformers that said let's do a 3-year rotation. I think people know less of the Bible because of that. You know, they don't retain those 3 as they retained the 1 year.
Everyone wants a 1-year lectionary,
well,
except everyone that doesn't want a 1-year lectionary.
They don't want it, but they should have it.
So you're saying the reformers, they wanted the 3, like some of the reformers wanted 3-year, just for more biblical literacy, perhaps?
When you say the reformers, I would say the mid of the 1900s reformers. They just wanted. I mean, it was a noble thing. Let's get more of the Bible in the church, you know. But what resulted is that people have less of the Bible on their hearts, and they lose that rhythm, that yearly rhythm, that is. You know, and of course you have the daily office. So if you're at the daily office, then you get obviously a lot more of the Bible, and then of course you have your individual Bible study out of that. But for it to be pinned by what the wisdom of the church has considered to be the most important, the quintessential texts, you know, the Book of Common Prayer is the Bible ordered for prayer. And so, you know, it would be worth it for us to take it seriously, what the inheritance that we've received.
I'll have to ask someone who's Orthodox about what their lectionary is, because I think they have the pig passage like 3 times during the year. Or something like that.
Where the pigs jump off the cliff?
Yeah, where like Christ sends the demons into the pigs. I think they have that some like 3 times. That's what I heard in a podcast somewhere. It's like, yeah, we're really into casting demons out and exorcism. Yeah.
Well, it's funny because like with the pigs, there's no reason for Jews to have pigs.
Yeah, it does. You are
Like,
like, wait
why
a
are
second.
people upset about the pigs at the time? Which there's some.
They're not supposed to be eating them pigs.
Yeah, they're not supposed to be eating the pigs. And the pigs, what are the pigs going to do? Like help pull your plow? They're not going to. No, that's not how pigs work.
They're eating bacon.
They're eating bacon. Yeah, that's what's happening.
Yeah, yeah.
Demonic bacon.
That for sure is demonic. Well, I guess if they pulled them out of the ocean.
Yeah.
Yeah, but they weren't demonic before the demons were in them. They were just pigs. They're just non-kosher pigs.
Yeah.
Then I guess you'd have salty demonic bacon.
Yeah.
Anyway, but yeah, it's an interesting question. I wonder what, you would think, well, you don't have as much of the Gospels if you're on a 1-year lectionary versus a 3-year lectionary, but at least with the Orthodox, that is not the case, because when they get to Holy Week and they're like, we need to read all of the narratives for Maundy Thursday, they're like, how about we break that up into 12 readings, and we'll intersperse every reading with another litany and like 3 psalms. So there is no shortage, at least in the Eastern Church, of reading scripture, but we don't really do that in the Anglican Church. We're like, you know what, we'll just go ahead and read the Passion on Palm Sunday, just in case people can't show up.
We do it every day of Holy Week. Right? We go through all 4 of the narratives on Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, and then and Friday, and then Saturday, of course, is the burial and the baptism, and then of course then there's the Easter Vigil where we do the 9 lessons, and we don't do all the psalms yet, but maybe someday. So, but yeah. We're all.
I did this
covering
last
these
year
liturgies.
for the first time. My friend Mark Avra, because at the church I'm at, we don't do an Easter Vigil, but at Mark's church, he was like, "Yeah, let's do the vigil."
The sunrise thing is fine unless you're at the Easter Vigil. Otherwise, you're just
Which is what I did this last year.
That was rough.
I did vigil till and he was like, let's do it the traditional way. We won't start until like 10:30 p.m. So we started the vigil at like 10:30 p.m. and then it was over at like 1:30. It was great. I told him, I said, I'm willing to do it if we do all the readings with all the psalms in between.
Yeah, they're wonderful.
So just the readings, and we basically chanted all the psalms as well. I got 3 other people to, Melanie and myself and another couple, and we learned, and another guy, so there's 5 of us. So we basically did all the chants and simplified Anglican chant for the psalms. It was great. It took like an hour and 20 minutes to do all the readings, but really brought home if you do all the readings.
Yeah. It's almost like that was the intent.
There was one other thing I wanted to ask you. You were talking about postmodern composition. So my take on all the postmodern music, it's like postmodernism in general. It's mostly bad, but there is some good there. So in the sense of what postmodernism does is, in its attempt to deconstruct everything and to take all meta-narrative, to basically make everything a meta-narrative.
Right.
Then it actually does afford this unique opportunity to recapitulate meta-narratives. So then no meta-narrative is greater than any other meta-narrative, and then because of that, then what's the means of judging meta-narratives? Well, the only possible means is appealing to something like beauty or something like that, in which case then Christianity still wins, which is sort of, I make this argument when I'm talking to Jonathan about The Matrix. It's like, well, The Matrix is sort of actually kind of like an antichrist thing in reality. It's a deconstruction of death and resurrection, but you can only deconstruct the death and resurrection if you recapitulate the death and resurrection. So there still is the Christ story in there. And so for me in music, I think there are a few composers who kind of live into that, which I don't know if they would have been possible just purely secularist modernity, like Arvo Pärt and Messiaen, where in some sense they kind of are postmodern, or the postmodern aesthetic landscape gives rise to them being able to compose the music that they do, but they themselves are still a return to traditional Christianity.
I would say that, if, like, as a metaphor, whenever there is a volcanic eruption that just decimates everything, what ends up happening is the ground becomes very fertile. And so you have this desolation, and things can emerge from it. And they can emerge relatively quickly and take root. I think that's the case. I also think that if you're talking about just on a philosophical level, the idea of evil, evil is not creative, right? And while a lot of the postmodern thoughts, if you take them to their logical conclusion, then it's all destruction. But just the idea of creativity itself means that that postmodernism can't ever really be all the way. It has to rely on actual creativity and actual virtue. And so, yeah, there's no such thing as pure evil, and there's no such thing as pure unadulterated postmodernism. There has to be a foothold in order to have any sort of truth in it. So yeah, I do think that, if people are like this death metal
I know you're
music,
not the biggest Parrot fan, but
well, I mean, it's fine. I mean, I've sung some things by him that I thought were perfectly fine. It's a little atmospheric for my taste, but that's fine. Other people like it. But this idea of these like death metal bands and stuff, they're playing open fifths. They're basically playing like a medieval drone, and people, who are very nihilistic are still basically worshiping. They're misguided, of course, but they're doing a religious act by sort of, I don't know, bobbing and stuff. I've never been. You can tell that I've never been to one of these things, but yeah, I mean, I would just imagine like in people's attempt to get as far away from truth and beauty as they can, if they really take stock, they'll find that they can't run. Or they can run, but they're not going to get very far.
It was great to talk to you, Andrew. I think your curial stuff is great. These mass settings are wonderful. I love your anthems, especially that mud anthem I keep talking about.
Well, you can plug my YouTube channel, and they can hear some of the curial there. So
that'd be great. And you're on Spotify as well, right?
And Spotify, that's right.
So, where do you find it on Spotify? Just Andrew Dittman or Andrew Dittman St. Timothy
Andrew
service?
Dittman turns out not to be a super great stage name, so nobody else has it. It's only me.
Well, thank you for everything, Andrew. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thanks for
having me. I think people will enjoy this.
All right. Bye-bye.